Welcome to another episode of the Mindset Recruiting Podcast. I'm Alex Rojas, your talent advisor and host. And in today's episode, we're going to be talking about the rise and the fall of staffing agencies. That's right. I'm going to go back into the past and give you some history lesson on staffing agencies. And then we're going to touch on the present. I'm going to give you some deep dive information on data and statistics when it comes to staffing agencies. And I'm going to set you up for the future state of staffing agencies, in particular headhunters, because that's what recruiters are known for. They're known to be headhunters within the staffing agency realm. I'm going to set you up for the next episode, because at that next episode, we're going to dive even deeper on why staffing agencies have such a stigma, a stench, why they're known to be known as villains, right? So I'm going to go ahead and maybe debunk that and maybe look at the hero aspects of it. But for right now, let's take a deep dive into the rise and fall of staffing agencies. So before we dive into it, I have to give you some context as far as what my experience, my background is working within a staffing agency, what my story is. This is how I can validate my level of expertise for you. Now, I got out of college in the mid-1990s. So I'm going to date myself here. Staffing agencies were just getting into corporate America. It was a new era that was on the cusp, because I was still at that point where candidates were actually faxing resumes to recruiters in order to get visibility. So I was a business marketing major, and I started my first gig actually doing telecommunications and selling long distance phone coverage. And so, but I saw a market within the recruiting area, and I saw friends that they were getting involved in recruiting. So I really targeted and found one of the best agencies that I thought was out there, and that was Aerotech. I mean, Aerotech today is Tech Systems. And so I targeted them. I targeted them for the sole purpose of really obtaining their training, because they had such an intensive, superior training program for their recruiters. Within 6 months, I was promoted into sales and account management. That was their business model. I opted to not go down that career path and instead pivoted over to become an independent contract recruiter. I went ahead and did that for 18 months. I worked for a $100 million e-commerce company in the DC metro area, and I was able to build an internal recruiting agency within corporate America. So that was really the start of more startup companies starting to build in-house recruiting teams. And I got valuable insight and experience being able to do that. I then started to plot what my next move was, which was ultimately me and my business partner launching our own staffing firm. It was just the two of us. It was in Fairfax, Virginia, Northern Virginia area, in Washington, D.C., and we launched it. Within 3 years, we had a few major accounts in telecommunications, and we almost grew to 100 contractors on our payroll. Our internal staff tripled in size. We had about 4 or 5 recruiters. We had a couple of sales reps. We had administrative support. We even had interns, and everything was going great into my mid to late 20s. And then the dot-com bubble happened and everything exploded. 9/11 came and the world changed. Had to make a pivot, and I got into consulting, and really what I got into was more of a lone wolf boutique type of consulting business model. So throughout the years, I pivoted multiple times. I supported a lot of different companies, small, mid-sized, large, enterprise, best companies in the world. I did it as a contractor, as a consultant, as a full-time employee, and that is my story. That's the story of recruiting. That's the origins of my staffing agency. So as we move in to these next segments of this podcast, I want you to have assurances that I know what I'm talking about. So let's get to it. As we get into it, we're going to give you a lesson on the history of recruiting. Did you know that staffing agencies have been around since the late 1800s and early 1900s? America was built off of recruiters gathering people for hunting, for farming, for building America, and especially for our military. If you haven't seen my episode, The Top 5 Greatest Recruiters of All Time, I encourage you to watch that. I cover a lot of this as far as the greatest recruiters that ever existed existed since the beginning of mankind. It's a really fascinating podcast. Now, the Industrial Revolution and World War I and II, they played a really significant and important part in evolving recruiting industry. And it wasn't really until the 1950s and the 60s that the rise of large corporations that led to developing in-house human resource departments really kind of brought in recruiting and the whole process of hiring. I think to this day, this is why human resources really is sort of a lot of times seen above talent acquisition, because that's where the origins came from. Now, the market and really everything changed because this was the beginning of professionalizing really the recruiting field, which is known today as talent acquisition. Now, in the 1980s and the 1990s, technology, internet, and social media, that all led to this new era of recruiting. This made it easier for recruiters now not waiting for fax machines, but now they could reach out globally to talent communities. And that has been a game changer. So where are we today? The digital revolution of recruiting is on the verge. We're here. This is a new age when it comes to artificial intelligence. And let's discuss that more. So for us to understand the state of staffing agencies as it is today, we're going to have to dive deep into some statistics here. So I want you to understand that. So roll up your sleeves. I'm going to show you some graphs and some charts. But when we look at the business model, ultimately the business model says that staffing agencies really are all about permanent placements, hiring temporary workers, or hiring temporary contract workers to eventually go into a perm status. That's contract to hire. So this is the business model that we're talking about when we're talking about staffing agencies. Today, statistics show us that there's nearly about 300,000 recruiters that work in staffing agencies. That's in the US. Overall, we're probably close to about 1 million recruiters when we're looking at that. And if you look at LinkedIn and do searches, everything from recruiting coordinators to executive recruiters or VP level recruiters, it's going to probably come out to closer to about 1 million profiles that are out there. Now, in 2023, globally, worldwide, staffing agencies were able to earn almost $600 billion. That's US dollars that they were able to earn. Now, US staffing firms are almost able to earn half of that. We're talking about $230 billion plus in 2023 alone that the US was able to do. And that was significant growth over the previous 3 years. Now, this map shows you where the US is when it comes to relation on a global scale. And you can clearly see that they dominate globally when it comes to revenues that come into the staffing agency world. Now, that is expected to grow even more. They're projecting in the next 5 years within the US that there's going to be about $330 billion worth of business being done within staffing agencies. Now, take a look at this other graph here. In this other graph here, you can see the different industries within staffing agencies and where all the money is. Obviously, industrial is a big part of it. You're talking about $21 billion worth of spending there. Administrative and clerical is another one. IT, project management, health, engineering and science is rising. And then there's those other miscellaneous categories as well. There are over 25,000 staffing agencies across the U.S. alone. We're talking about over 50,000 offices, brick and mortar offices, staffing agencies, and that doesn't even include the small mom and pop recruiters that are opening their own boutique firms in their own homes. On average, a staffing agency earns about $4 million per year. That's gross revenue. When we talk about profit margins, we're probably looking at estimated averages somewhere between 10 to 15%. That's what makes it lucrative. Now, in order to start a staffing agency today, and then we're talking again about a brick and mortar traditional staffing agency, you probably have to invest about $150,000 to $250,000 to get that started at a bare minimum. Obviously, if you don't have a brick and mortar, it's a lot easier as far as the startup cost goes. At any given week, there's over 2.5 million temporary contract workers in the US that are clocking in and clocking out. And throughout 2023, there were over, I think it was 13 million temporary contract workers that were hired. That's right, 13 million temps were hired in 2023. That means that more than 90% of companies that are out there, we're talking corporate companies, small, mid, large, they are using staffing agencies. And that is the pulse on the marketplace today. That is the rise. As much stigma that staffing agencies get, at the end of the day, the bottom line is that companies are still using them as an extension to their company's needs and hiring needs and everything that they need there as well. As we close this segment of this podcast and we talk about the rise and fall of staffing agencies, really want to set you up for the next episode, because the rise and fall of staffing agencies that you can clearly look here, there's still a stigma out there. There's still a stigma within staffing agencies and recruiters that work in staff agencies. Now, it really depends on who the buyer is, but corporate America has already staked their claim that they use staffing agencies. It's all part of their business model. And you can look at Forbes 2024 best staffing agencies. These are the top 10 staffing agencies that Forbes has listed as being one of the best. Now, if you can look at this data points here, you can see that there's one common denominator, and that denominator is that they have longevity. They have history. They go back decades. So they've built a mature business model and they have a sense of history. But if we were to dissect staffing agencies and how they deliver candidates to corporate America, you would have to dig a lot more deeper. I mean, we started this episode off by saying that staffing agencies, recruiters are known as headhunters whenever they work for staffing agencies, but they're also known as solopreneurs or 50-50 split recruiters, or the boutique recruiting firms, the mom and pop shops, the RPO firms, which are a little bit more established. You have regional agencies as well. You have mini franchises that spread out throughout the country or on a coastline. And there are enterprise agency firms as well. You can see that they come in all different shapes and sizes. And so what we wanted to look at in this episode, we wanted to set you up for the next one, because in the next episode, we're going to highlight specifically why staffing agencies are seen as both villains and heroes. We've already touched a little bit on the heroes now, but we're really going to look at the villains, the stigma, the stench behind staffing agencies that's out there. I hope this podcast was informative. Remember to subscribe, to like, to share, to comment. Until the next time, remember, it's all about the mindset.